Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yoma Daf Ayin. Shavua Tov to everyone. This week's learning is sponsored by Bill and Shiur Futurnik in memory of Bill's father and Shiur's grandfather, David ben Yaakov Zichrono Livracha, in his third year at site. Although not ritually observant in the traditional sense, he taught us through example. As a writer, he would never touch his IBM Selectric, Smith Corona, or any other means of writing on Shabbat. He was a man who truly valued treating people with kindness and for whom family was of paramount importance. Today's daf is also sponsored by Emma Rimberg in loving memory of Dr. Eric Glick, who passed away on the 10th of Tammuz 31 years ago, taken from us too soon. Daddy had the calming hand of a doctor, a beautiful singing voice, a deep knowledge of Torah, he knew Chumash by heart, and a great emunah in Hashem. He was a Zionist all his life and would be so proud of all of his family, his legacy. I miss him a lot. May his memory be blessed and our learning bring an aliyah to his neshama. Today, we're going to be first finishing this section about the reading of the Torah. So I'll just do a quick review of the Mishnah that we saw, where we had basically the Kohen Gadol. Remember, he goes to read from the Torah. And then he says, they pass the Torah from one to the other. He starts to read. He reads two sections in Vayikra Tet Zayin, about the Avodat Yom Kippurim. Then he skips to Vayikra 23, where it talks about the day and the sanctity of the day, and this section with all the holidays. Then he skips to Sefer Bamidbar. Today we're going to talk a lot about the connection between what it says in Vayikra Tet Zayin and what it says in Bamidbar, where it lists in Parshat Pinchas, which we'll get to very soon in 2 weeks, about the sacrifices, the additional sacrifices brought on every holiday. And he read the ones about Yom Kippur, which extra sacrifices you bring, the Korbanot Musaf. Then the issue there, though, is, question, how can he skip from Tet Zayin to Kaf Gimel? That we said is okay, because he can do it quickly, because it's very close. But he can't skip all the way to Bamidbar. That's too far, and it's going to be what we call Tircha de Tzibura. It's going to be a pain for everyone to sit there waiting, which we'll see that inside today. And therefore, he says it by heart. Then it talks about in the Mishnah, again, I'll just review the Mishnah. Then he says a series of 8 blessings, even though there's really 9 mentioned there. We had a bit of an issue with that. He says 8 blessings, and then it tells us the strange line, which we'll try to talk about a little bit today, which is if you see the Par and Seir, then you can't see the Kohen Gadol reading. And the reverse, if you're seeing the Kohen Gadol reading, you can't see the Par and the Seir burning. And then the Mishnah tells you, which is the more strange line, which is V'lo mipnei she'eino rashay, not because you're not allowed to, but ela shayta derech rechoka u'melechet shnehen shava ke'echad. It's because they were far away and you wouldn't be able to technically be in both places. You can't dance at 2 weddings, but you can't be in 2 places at once. And that's the reason why we talked about, maybe the Mishnah is telling us this is a lesson for life, right? They're saying, just remember every decision you make, you're losing out on something else, but it doesn't mean, right? It means it's great you're there. Just remember, right? It's okay. That whole FOMO, fear of missing out, don't be so worked up about it. Be where you are. Don't try to think about where you're not. We'll see what the Gemara does with it, because that's not exactly what the Gemara thinks when it says it, although maybe the idea will somewhat connect. Okay, so starting from the top of our daf, B'golel Sefer Torah. So now it says and then the other part I forgot to mention is he rolls up the Sefer Torah when he finishes reading in Vayikra, before he continues to Bamidbar, and he puts it in his lap. V'kol kach lama. So why does he do that? Kedei shelo lotzi laz al Sefer Torah. The reason is, and some people explain, why does he put it in his lap? It's so that people don't think that there's something wrong with the Sefer Torah, because why is he rolling it up? And why is he going to say the next section by heart, right? And why does he say, some people say this is really to explain, why does he say, which I also forgot to mention when I was reviewing the Mishnah, he says, Yoter mimasha karati lifnechem katuv kan. More than what I'm reading is said here, meaning I'm going to read the next section by heart. Alternatively, maybe he's referring to the fact that I skipped in Vayikra, when I skipped from chapter 16 to chapter 23, not because it's not in this book. It's not like I'm just reading straight and it's missing a whole section. Or the reason I'm reading by heart this next section in Bamidbar is not because it's not in the book and the Sefer Torah is missing something. No, it's because, it's for a different reason. And that's why he wants to tell you that there's more written in this book than I'm reading, so that you don't think that the book is missing something. So now this section he reads by heart. Amai, niglo v'nikre. Why didn't he just roll the Torah and read? Because we don't roll the Torah in front of the community, because we don't want to mipnei kavod hatzibur. It's not respectful to the community to be doing that. Okay, by the way, we do this anyway. We do this. And we'll talk about some things that we do. For example, in Corona Minyanim, it was very common because usually you only have one Torah. And if you have to read from different sections, we roll the Torah. So we actually do this. But I guess when there's an option, they didn't want to do it. And it wasn't like Kriyat Torah the way it is, the way we do it. Anyway, they say that is an issue. Sometimes we have no choice, but it is an issue. So now, obviously, why don't you just have two Sifrei Torah? That's the way we do it in shul. When you have to read, right, on Rosh Chodesh, let's say, where you read the Parshat HaShavua, Rosh Chodesh falls on Shabbat, and then you read the section from Maftir from Bamidbar, these chapters that we're talking about now, where it talks about all the Musaf Korbanot, you read the chapter about Rosh Chodesh. So there we have two Sifrei Torah, if you're not in a street minyan, for example, so you would have two Torahs. So why don't we do that? So the answer, Rav Huna bar Yehuda Amar, we're going to have two answers. One, Mishum Pigmosha Rishon. People might say the first one is messed up, and that's why you opened the second Torah. And we don't want people to think that the Torah was messed up. It's the same idea as before. We don't want people to think that's missing, right? That there's something wrong with it. So that's possibly one reason. Rish Lakish Amar Mishum Bracha She'enat Tzricha. Every time you take out a new Torah, you have to make another blessing on the Torah. In which case, it's going to be an unnecessary blessing. Now, it's a little bit strange. Unnecessary blessings means you don't need to make the blessing. This actually is a case where if you bring out a Torah, you need to make a blessing. So it's not exactly what we generally call bracha levatala, a wasted bracha. It's not. A wasted bracha is if I said, let's say I eat, I drink some water, and I make a bracha shakol, and then 2 minutes later, I take another sip of water, and I make a bracha shakol. If I did that, that would be an unnecessary bracha. In this case, I'm actually obligated to make another bracha because I'm taking out a new Torah. So I am obligated. It's not really a bracha she'enat tzricha. So you learn here something interesting about bracha she'enat tzricha, that you should try to avoid situations where you have to make the same bracha on the same thing. Right? If you could do it in some other way, which in this case is read it ba'al peh, then without taking out another Torah, then you should do it that way and not create a situation where you're going to be obligated to make a bracha when you don't really necessarily need to. By the way, there's a whole separate issue with the sugya, which is there's this concept, and you might know half of the statement more so than the other half, which is things that were passed down orally, you're not supposed to be writing down. That's this whole thing about the oral Torah being written down. At a certain point, they said, listen, we're losing the Torah, we have to write it down, but ideally it wasn't meant to be written down. And flip of that is things that are written are not supposed to be recited ba'al peh. They're not supposed to be just recited without reading them inside. So how could he be reading the section of the Torah ba'al peh? You're not really supposed to do that. That's a separate question. Some of the commentaries ask. You can research it if you want. Okay, now we have two reasons why we didn't just bring another Sefer Torah. Either because people are going to say, oh, this first Torah is a problem, which then begs the question, then why do we do it that way? Right? Why do we take out two Sefer Torah, sometimes three Sefer Torah in shul? Did people, people aren't suspect, oh, it must be you have a Pasuk Sefer Torah, that's why you're taking out another one. And the second answer is because of it's just an unnecessary blessing because you'll have to make a new bracha. To which the Gemara asks now on the first one, are we really concerned that if we take out multiple Sefer Torah, people will think that there's something wrong with the Sefer? He says, and here's an example from our lives, Rosh Chodesh Tevet. Okay, why specifically Tevet did they choose? Because Kislev Tevet, right? It happens. Rosh Chodesh Tevet is in the holiday of Hanukkah. Hanukkah, the special Torah reading. Shabbos, the special Torah reading. And it's also Rosh Chodesh, the special Torah reading. So how many Sifrei Torah do we take out? 3. So Rosh Chodesh Tevet, Shechali Yop Shabbat, if it comes out on Shabbat, Mivi'in Shalosh Torot. Korein Echat Be'inyano Shel Yom, Echat Shel Rosh Chodesh, Ve'echat Shel Chanukah, right? One, the Parshat Shavua, one, Rosh Chodesh, for the new moon, and one for Hanukkah. So there, we don't seem to be concerned that people are going to say, oh, the Torah is messed up. So what do they answer? There's a difference between that and what we do. Why? If 3 different people are reading from 3 different Sifrei Torah, then we're not worried. Now, in our day, we don't do that. We have the same person reading from each, but we do have people getting aliyot. Okay, in those days, whoever got an aliyah was the person who read from the Torah. So we do have 3 different people because each time we have a different person who comes up to do the aliyah. So when you have 3 different people, then you understand, oh, this is something different from the previous, and you don't worry, maybe the Sefer is ruined. But in our case, who's reading from the Torah? The Kohen. So Chagavra b'trei sifrei ikapgama. But one person with 2 books or 3 books, or however many it would be, right, would create a problem. People would think that there was something wrong. The Kohen Gadol starts reading from one book, right? He's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. He can't roll because of coveted tzibur issues, but he can't take out another Torah because people will think there's something wrong with it. So therefore he's stuck, and that's why he reads it by heart. Continuing on, he makes 8 blessings. Tanu Rabbanam. Now we're going to have a brighter about these 8 blessings. Ala Torah, kederech shemevarchim bebeit hakneset. That's the brachot we say on the Torah. Al avodah v'al hoda'a v'al mechilat avon kitikna. These are like the usual brachot that we see. Again, avodah is the bracha of ritzeh that we ask that the avodah in the temple be accepted. Nowadays, we change that bracha a little bit because there's no longer a temple. I mean, not just nowadays, but as soon as the temple was destroyed, our eyes are seeking to return the temple. But the words of Ritzeh, the content of it is that Hashem should accept our ishet, our sacrifices. So the blessing ended a little differently then than it does now, whereas God will return his presence to Zion. But then it was that God shall accept our prayer, our avoda, what we did, our sacrifices. Al hodah is modim, the blessing of thanks. Al mechilat avon is the blessing that we say for Shmona Esrei in on Yom Kippur. Melech mocher v'salech lavonot lavonot amo be'Yisrael ma'avir shmoteinu b'chol shana v'shana. I don't know if they have. It's like one of those super long brachot. I think part of it was added over time. Wasn't all there. In fact, it even combines the concept of Melech Mocher V'Salech that we have from like I think it even says Melech HaKol Haaretz, I forget, but from Rosh Hashanah, the concept of Rosh Hashanah of Malchuyot. Anyway, it's a very long text. I don't know if they had the exact same thing then, but that's the basic concept. And Al Mikdash B'Fnei Atzmo, there was a special blessing on the Mikdash, on the temple. Al Kohanim B'Fnei Atzmam, there was a blessing for the Kohanim. Okay, these we were not familiar with from our prayer. V'Al Yisrael B'Fnei Atzman, a blessing for the Jewish people. Ve'al shar tefillah, and on the rest of tefillah. I'm not so clear what that means. We're going to see right now. Tanu Rabbanan u'shar tefillah. What does that mean? Rinat china b'chasha melefanecha alamcha Yisrael shetzruchim lipasha. We say we beseech God on behalf of the Jewish people that needs salvation. V'chotem b'shomei tefillah, and he finishes with shomei tefillah. Some people say that this is the text. You would say the words Rinat china b'chasha melefanecha. The same sugya appears in Sota, and the word milfanecha is missing. When you say milfanecha, it sounds like it's the text of a blessing because it's before you. Other people, if you read this Masechet Sukkah there, Sota, some people think that what it's saying is we say some sort of rina, tefillah, bakasha about the Jewish people that they need salvation, and it's just telling you what's the content of what's supposed to be in that blessing. They don't exactly tell you what the blessing is. Maybe I should just talk for a minute, zoom out for a minute and talk about prayer in those days. For the most part, when we talk about prayer in the Gemara and we give a blessing, often we just give the end of the blessing and we say, the content of what's supposed to be in there. But each chazan, each person who got up to daven would use their own text. This is really after the destruction of the temple when the prayer is just developing and the wording of the prayer, right? Some prayers existed in the time of the temple. Some prayers developed after, and they were in development stage. They weren't finalized. It wasn't so clear. Nowadays we have a siddur. Everything's written. Of course, we have different versions of that siddur, right? Nusach Sfar, Nusach Ashkenaz, Eidot Mizrach. We have all different kinds. But basically, whatever it is that you daven, it's all almost set in stone, so to speak. Whereas in those days, it was much more fluid. So there's 2 different ways of reading this, whether this was the exact text or this was the content of what was supposed to be in the bracha. But you should, kind of make your own bracha. This is a very interesting line. Wouldn't have expected this to be. Everybody brings Sefer Torah mi beito v'korebo. Everybody brings a Sefer Torah from their house and starts reading it. Okay, you have all these people standing in the temple. The Kohen Gadol reads the Torah. Everybody else brings the Torah and reads. Right? It's nice, Emma. You said about your father how he knew Chumash by heart here. Where it's all about the reading of the Torah we're talking about today. Kedei laharot chazuto l'rabim. Why did they do this? They wanted to show the beauty of each person's Sefer Torah to everybody. They wanted to kind of publicize the importance of reading the Torah. Very strange. Why is this happening in the middle of Yom Kippur? What's going on here? And everyone had a Sefer Torah in their house, right? I imagine this is an exaggeration. I'm sure it wasn't everybody, but maybe a few people went and brought their Sefer Torah. What's the idea here? Maybe it was some way, again, there's this struggle between people wanting to be part of the service. And really the Kohen Gadol was the main one, and he was doing everything. In fact, we even have this thing, you can't take out multiple Sefer Torah because it was only one person reading, right? We don't even share the reading of the Torah. But maybe this was some way that the people that were there wanted to have some sort of involvement. So they brought their own Torah and stood up and read the section. They probably read the section from Yom Kippur to kind of feel they had a part of things. Anyway, not sure. It's very interesting to think about. And certainly none of this was mentioned in our Mishnah. Okay, now the very last line before we get to the next Mishnah. And basically we're going to finish up the end of the service of the Kohen Gadol on that day. Right? We had this weird line. You can't be at both places. You can't dance 2 weddings, right? And not because you can't, just because it's too far and they all happen simultaneously. Pshita, isn't this obvious? Why is the Mishnah telling us something that's totally obvious? Of course, if you're there, you can't be there. And if you're there, you can't be there. We know that. So that's just a technical thing. Why would you be telling us? Maybe you would say like Rish Lakish. Dama Rish Lakish. Ein ma'avirin ala mitzvot. You can't pass up opportunities for a mitzvah, right? We saw this before. You can't pass the mizbeach and not put the blood on that part, right? At the end, we say you do, but you have to go right back to the one you passed over because there's this issue of passing by an opportunity to do a mitzvah. Umay mitzvah, what's the mitzvah here? Berov am hadrat melech. The mitzvah is that things are done with crowds. That's being part of this crowd is part of the mitzvah, to kind of be there and be where you are. So now what's it telling you? So you would think that if you're standing in one place, you can't go to the other place, not because you can't dance at 2 weddings. It didn't tell you that. It's because you're not allowed. You're here in this mitzvah. Don't go to the next mitzvah. You're here. Don't pass this mitzvah in order to go to another one. So if they're burning the par in the seer, you're not allowed to walk in to where the Kohen Gadol is reading, or vice versa, because that would be passing up a mitzvah. So you might have thought that's the case. And what's the mitzvah? To be Berov Amadrat Melech. God is glorified when there's more of a crowd. So if you leave there, right, this is like, I don't know, in my head, there's protests because there's protests going on right around the corner for me all the time. So you're at a protest rally and you leave. So once you leave, right, there's less people. It doesn't look as impressive, right? It's nice you showed up, but in the end you leave. So your presence maybe was there for a few minutes, but then you left and then you're not there anymore. So it doesn't look like there's such a crowd, right? Let's say a whole bunch of us leave all at once and then there's not much of a crowd, and that's what you really need there, to be a crowd. So here, right, Adarabah, we're not talking about protests, but we're talking about worshiping God. Here you have a big crowd, right? If you leave, you're making the crowd smaller. It's true, you're going to a different mitzvah, but you're passing out over this mitzvah. So now, what do we have? Kamash Malan. Now, this is an interesting Kamash Malan. Kamash Malan, now what? What's it teaching us? That we don't hold by Rish Lakish. You can be Ma'avirin ala mitzvot. That's probably unlikely. Or Kamash Malan, Rashi says that Kamash Malan dilav ma'avalhu. This isn't considered la'avor ala mitzvot. Okay, like to leave the protest. That doesn't. You went to the protest. You did go. So the fact that you're leaving early doesn't mean you're, this. Why? Here's a fascinating line. What does it mean to do a mitzvah? To do a mitzvah, and this is interesting for those who, and there's not many of you, but some of you might have heard Rabbanit Dreyfus speak yesterday in our shul. She spoke about this idea of what is a mitzvah. She was talking about shlichut for a mitzvah. If I send someone to do a mitzvah for me, can I do that, right? Like I can do a yipoi koch, I can have someone write a contract for me, right? I can have them sign for me. I can have someone send a get for me. I can have someone betroth someone. I can have someone, right? There's certain things you could do. You can have someone do it. Can I have someone daven for me? Can I have someone, right? What does it mean, right? And then she talked about, well, it questions, what does it mean to do a mitzvah? What is a mitzvah? So here they're saying to just be standing there, you're not actively doing a mitzvah. So ema v'rina mitzvot is when you're actually involved in a mitzvah. Here you're watching. You're not an active participant. So ema v'rina mitzvot doesn't apply when you're not an active participant. I'm going to throw out an idea, which is I thought about in Masechet Pesachim, there was this Mishnah where it talked about the chazeret and the dippings and the maror, and it says there's chazeret and there's maror. And anyway, Rish Lakish, sort of out of left field, says, you can learn from this Mishnah that mitzvot tzrichot kavanah, that they need intent. And I was thinking, it's the same Rish Lakish. It was talking about what is a mitzvah? A mitzvah without intent isn't really a mitzvah, right? A mitzvah with just standing there, unless you're an active participant, it's not really a mitzvah. So anyway, it's something to think about. Right, Becky, I was thinking about that yesterday when Rabbanit was speaking about this idea of paying someone to say Kaddish for you, right? Is it, and she showed all these different models. Is it that mitzvot get done and it doesn't really matter, right? We want mitzvot happening in the world. It doesn't matter that you do them. It's just important that there be mitzvot. And there's some approaches that kind of view it that way, as opposed to saying, what do you mean? The mitzvah is for me. Like Kaddish is a good example. Now, Kaddish isn't exactly a mitzvah, it's custom, but is the idea of Kaddish for the person, or is the idea of Kaddish for the person saying Kaddish, right? Or for the person who died? So again, this all gets into very, very interesting questions. Okay, unfortunately, not enough time for us to think about them in Daf Yomi. We're going to move on, but good to think about them. Mishnah now starts off. It's a very strange thing, because you'd expect to say, if he was reading the Torah with his big day boots, remember the last Mishnah said, he could change his clothes, or he could leave those Kohen Gadol clothes on that he was wearing when he was doing the special Avodat Yom Kippur. So remember, he wears these white linen clothes for the Yom Kippur, special Yom Kippur service, the par, the seir, when he goes into Kodesh Kodashim, and even when he's not in Kodesh Kodashim, when he's doing those specific, dealing with the bull and the goat, versus when he's doing the other things of that day, which is the Tamid Shel Shachar, the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim, the Musaf sacrifices, all the other things, even though the Musaf sacrifices are special for Yom Kippur, but they're not the Avodat Yom Kippurim. And today we're going to see that split between them. Those he wears the big day Zahav. When it came to reading the Torah, it wasn't clear whether he had to change his clothes or not. So the Mishnah starts off, if he's still wearing his clothes, and it doesn't say, and if he's not, okay, if you already changed, it doesn't really tell you. But the assumption is if he already changed his clothes, okay, I'm going to mention a machloket we had in the past. There was a whole machloket. He does, let's go back to the beginning. He does 5 dippings, right? He goes to the mikvah 5 times, and he does 10 sanctifications of his hands and feet, right? Washing his hands and feet. There was a debate, is each time he dips in the mikveh, he changes his clothes. So the debate is, does the two washing hands, one goes on taking off the clothes and one goes on putting on the clothes, or is one before he puts on the clothes and one after he puts it on, but nothing having to do with taking off the clothes? So meaning, and this Mishnah goes according to the opinion that you do one washing before you take off the clothes and one washing before you put them on. That's why the Mishnah is going to say, if he's still wearing big day boots when he read from the Torah, then at this point, Kidesh Adav Raglav Pashat. At this point, he washes his hands and then takes off his clothes. And that's only because the Mishnah goes by the opinion that the washing your hands goes on the taking off the clothes, and then it'll go on putting on the clothes, but not that both are associated with putting on. So if he changed his clothes previously, then he already washed his hands before he took off the clothes, before he read from the Torah. Then he was wearing some white garments of his own personal garments. Then he just takes off those clothes. He obviously doesn't wash his hands now, because those aren't the clothes that you wash hands for. And then you would just pick up the Mishnah from here, if that was the other alternative. I'm telling you this because the Mishnah doesn't tell you what the other alternative is, but it's clear what it is. Pashat yarad v'taval. So he takes off his clothes. He now dips in the mikvah. Alav and his tafag, he gets out and he dries off. And now they bring him the gold clothes, which is the regular Kohen Gadol clothing, and he puts them on because, again, now the Kidesh Adav Raglav, there was also a machloket about it, whether he does it before he puts on the clothes, after he puts on the clothes. This one says, right, you do it before you take off the clothes, you wash your hands, and after you put on the clothes, you wash your hands. But we saw debates about that before. This Mishnah goes by one opinion. So now that was the third dipping of the day. Okay, let's just review. The first dipping was before he does the Tamid Shel Shachar, the first morning sacrifice. The second one was before he does the special Avodat Yom Kippurim, the par and the Seir LaHashem and the Seir LaZazel gets sent off. That is all done in the second dipping. And the reading of the Torah portion, that was this extra thing we added. And the animals were burnt and everything was done with the par seir, the blood, the animals being burnt outside the temple, all that. We took the innards out, we didn't yet burn them. Question's going to come up, when do we do that? Because it doesn't say so in our Mishnah. Okay, now, the third tefillah, he does Elo ve'et el ha'am. Okay, he does his own ayil. If you remember, it says in the very beginning of our chapter of Vayikra Tet Zayin, it says, B'zok yavo Aaron el HaKodesh, b'par ben bakar l'chatat va'ayil la'olah. In this way, Aaron will come with a par and with an ayil. And those seem to be his sacrifices. That's his Elo. And the El Ha'am, which is mentioned later in Pasuk 24 of the chapter. Okay, it says, I'll open it 1 second. In Vayikra Tet Zayin. This is going to be a whole debate. If you remember, we had this debate. Is this the same ayil that's mentioned in the Musaf sacrifices? Generally, chapter 16 of Vayikra doesn't mention all the Musaf sacrifices at all. But there's a debate about in verse 24, which is what we're up to right now, For achatz b'saro b'mayim, that's this. For lavash b'gadav, the third dipping. V'yatsa v'asat olato ve'et olat ha'am. He does his olah and the olah of the people. Now, his olah is the ayil. So they assume the olat ha'am is also an ayil. And the question is it saying then he does his ayil and the olah of the people that's mentioned in Sefer Bamidbar as part of the korbanot olah that he brings? We'll see. He brings 7 sheep and 1 ayil and 1 bull offering. That's for the musaf. So is this ayil referring to that ayil or not? There's a whole debate. So which really means in the end, there's either 2 elim, his own and the people's, or maybe there's 3. Maybe there's the people's, that's the one mentioned here. And then there's also the people's one that's part of the musaf. It's a big confusion. We're going to see in the Gemara, there's a debate about it. So now he basically does what it says in verse 24 in Vayikra, which right in order, as it says there. He does the Al and the El Ha'am. Now, what's the problem? It gives you a very nice order of events in chapter 16 of Vayikra, but it doesn't tell you anything about the Korbanot Musaf. So we don't know. They're all mentioned only in Bamidbar, like maybe the Ayah, but we're not sure. And the rest of them are certainly not mentioned. So the question is, what happens? When are those done? So like I said, there's a par, there's an ayil, and there's 7 kvasim. So now it says, Ve'et shiv'at kvasim t'mimim b'nei shana. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says at this point, he does his ayil, the ayil of the people, those are the 2 rams, and he does the 7 sheep, okay, that are mentioned in Sefer Bamidbar, that aren't mentioned here at all. He does those now. Rabbi Akiva Omer, what are you talking about? In Tamid Shel Shachar are you krivim? Those were sacrificed in the morning. They weren't sacrificed now. They were sacrificed in the first dipping, not in the third dipping, after the first tefillah when he does the morning sacrifice. Everyone agrees, by the way, that he starts at the morning and he ends with the afternoon tamid. That's always frames your day. That's always first, because tadir v'sheino tadir kodem. And we learned already also that the tamid shel ben arbaim was always the last, except for when there's korban pesach. That was the one exception, right? Where then you have to do it later, but generally that was the last thing done. So now the question is, when were those musaf sacrifices done? When were the 7? Now we're going to split a little bit between the 7 sheep, the par, and the ayil. Okay, it's not so clear. So let's see. So Rabbi Eliezer says we do the shivat kvasim, and notice he doesn't make mention of the par, the olah at all. Okay, or I'm sorry, not the par and the seir, the psukim. Okay, maybe it'll be helpful if I read you first the psukim in Bamidbar Kaftet. Okay, it says Be'asur, we're in pasuk zayin. Be'asur lechodesh hashvi'i. That's the 10th of the month, right? The 10th of Tishrei, Yom Kippur. It says some things. I'm not going to go into the first pasuk. It's not relevant. Then it says, next pasuk, B'kavtem olah, you make an olah sacrifice. Par ben bakar echad, ayil echad, kvasim b'nei shana shivat minim. So we have the par, the ayil, and the 7 sheep, like I said. Then, 2 psukim later, it says, and in addition, you bring a seir izim echad lechatat. I want to be very clear. This par and seir are not the par and seir that we did already. Those are special for the avodat Yom Kippurim. We brought the 2 seirim. One went to God, was sacrificed. One went to Azazel. And we had that par that was the par of the Kohen Gadol and his family and the Kohanim. He did all the confessions. That's separate. In addition, there's a par, a ram, and the whole question with the ram is it the same ram mentioned there or not? And the 7 sheep. And there's a seir izim echad lechatat, and it even tells you there, milvad chatat kippurim, just so there's no confusion. This is in addition to the one you do on Yom Kippur. Now later, the Gemara is going to darshan this verse and say, obviously it's in addition, because obviously, why? Because this is clear, this seir izim was done on the outside mizbeach, the big, tall altar. Remember, our seir was done inside the hechal on the small Torah altar, and the animal was burnt outside the temple entirely. The seir izim echad lechatat is the same we have on every holiday. We have it on Rosh Chodesh. It's always done on the big altar. So it's clearly a different sacrifice. So this, in addition to the Chatat Kippurim, is clearly unnecessary. We're going to darshan it. Okay, so let's go back to our topic. So we're in the 3rd tefillah. We have the ayil and the al ha'am, right? The ayil of Aharon and the one, or the Kohen Gadol, and the ayil of the people, the ram, the shivat kvasim that are all done now. According to Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva says no. Those are done, not the ayil and the al ha'am, that happens now, but the 7 sheep are done in the morning. Okay. in the first dipping, after you do the Tamid Shel Shachar, the morning daily sacrifice. I'm struggling to read this line because there's going to be a whole debate about the par ha'olah. You could put it's where you put the period. Is it that those were done with the Tamid Shel Shachar, par ha'olah, and also the par ha'olah, the bull that was brought as an olah? And then Shiur and Asa b'chutz was done with the Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim, right? There's a split in this. We don't know where to split the line. Or are the par, it's only the 7 sheep were done in the morning, and we're going to split between those 7 sheep and the par and the Shiur. Those are done in the afternoon with the afternoon sacrifice. Now, when did they do the afternoon sacrifice? This is very strange. It doesn't actually say anything about it in our Mishnah. We're going to have everything in our Mishnah, but they don't talk about the afternoon sacrifice. So Rashi says it was done after the 5th tefillah. When you're done with everything, it was the very last thing you do. Some people say, no, this is the end of the sacrifices. So it was done right now. It was just done at the end. So you basically have, right, that was the last thing done. And with that, you would do these things, okay, that these were all done after, but still within this 3rd tefillah, and not like Rabbi Akiva says that they were done in the morning. Okay, he said, and I'm sorry, not like, right, Rabbi Akiva says, the 7 sheep, I just got confused for a minute. Let me go back, erase what I just said. The 7 sheep were done with the Tamid of Shacharit in the morning, and the Parolah and the Shiur and Asa b'chutz were done with the Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim, which happens now. So either, the commentaries are conflicted about this. Either, like Rashi says, it happens with the 5th dipping, or other commentary says it happens now after you do the ram of Aaron, of the Kohen, and the ram of the people. Then you do the rest of the Ola ones, the Musaf sacrifices that didn't get done in the morning, the split between the sheep and the bull and the goat that are done part of the Musaf sacrifices. They get split between the morning and the afternoon. Soon we're going to see where this all comes from. So that's the 3rd tefillah. So again, there's machloket, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, what exactly goes on here? Okay, according to Rabbi Akiva, let's just review. The Ayil and the El Ha'am and the 7 sheep. He doesn't talk at all about what happens to the par and the Shiur. We don't know. The Gemara is going to ask that. That's Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. I might have just said Rabbi Akiva. I'm sorry. I'm a little confused this morning. That's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva says, no, those 7 were done in the morning. And the par ha'olah and the Shiur and Asa b'chutz were done with the afternoon, which, as I said, either 3rd tefillah or 5th tefillah. Now, next. But he obviously agrees, Rabbi Akiva, that you do the ayil now. Everyone agrees you do the ayil now. It's just a question what happens with the Musaf sacrifices. That's the big debate. So again, he changes, right? He washes his hands, changes his clothes. He now wears the white clothes. Why is he wearing them? Didn't we finish with the special avodah Yom Kippurim? What's left? We've learned about this before. He left inside the ladle and the pan, and he has to go get them out of Kodesh Kodeshim, so he has to wear the white clothes again. Now he needs to switch back to his clothes for what? We'll see in a minute. So he goes back to his regular Kohen Gadol clothes. He now goes to offer the incense from the afternoon sacrifice, and he goes to fix the candles. Some people say just to fix them. Some people say they don't need fixing. You did it in the morning. Some people say, well, you left one of the lights lit all day and you only put it out now, and therefore you have to clean that one out. And people mostly assume that you also light them, even though it doesn't say that. Now, what's the issue? Notice again, I told you this before. It doesn't say he brings the Korban Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim. So that's why they have this debate, Rashi and others, whether that also happened now and they just didn't mention it because it was obvious, or maybe it already happened in the 3rd dipping. Now, all he needs to do is one more Kiddush Yadayim v'Raglayim because he's taking off his clothes. And this is, again, according to the opinion that you do it when you take off the clothes, you wash your hands. He now goes back to his own regular clothes. If you know the Yisharibo song, right? It's part of the song. They escort him to his house. And Yom Tov he would make a huge celebration, right? We're done. He's finished. He comes out and he feels, right? This is where all these Paitanim came off and made all these beautiful songs about how glorious it was when the Kohen Gadol finished and he left. And right, really, that was when he left Kodesh Kodeshim. But here now he's finished with everything and he walks out and he has a celebration. Now, what do you mean? Celebration always has food. So some people say it happened Motzei Yom Tov. In other words, after Yom Kippur was over, he made a big feast. Some people say actually he did it the next day, because when was he going to prepare all the food for this huge feast? So he actually did it the next day. But the point is, he celebrates. He doesn't celebrate at this exact moment. That would be odd. We're in Yom Kippur. We're not having a big food celebration. And we're Jews, and celebrations always come with food. So must be it was done after. Okay, now the Gemara starts off and goes to that one line that I told you is very confusing. The par ha'olah, does it go with the previous or does it go with after? How do we read this? Here are the two options. In Tamid Shel Shachar Yukrivim, the 7 ones were done. The 7 sheep were done with the morning sacrifice. Upar ha'olah v'seir nasa b'chutz in Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim, and the other 2 were done with the afternoon. O Dilma Hachid Kamar, was it like this? In Tamid Shel Shachar Yukrivim, Upar ha'olah b'hadayu, and then it said, and the bull was done with them. V'seir nasa b'chutz in Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim. But the seir, now remember in the verse, the seir was separate from the rest. That's an additional one that goes later. Vitu, question number 2, we're going to have 3 questions. Par ha'olah Rabbi Eliezer d'Shairi, he doesn't even mention the par ha'olah Rabbi Eliezer. Remember, he just mentioned the 7. He didn't talk about the par. We don't know. And not only that, but the seir he doesn't mention. It's not clear what he thinks. When do you do those? And Vitu, bein le Rabbi Eliezer, bein le Rabbi Akiva, imulei chatat emad avilu. And they're all not mentioning this imulei chatat, right? The parts, the innards of the seir la Hashem and the par. When did they burn those? It doesn't say that anywhere. So they basically answer by saying, Amarava, lo mishkacha lama takanta ela ola Rabbi Eliezer ditana b'debei Shmuel ola Rabbi Akiva k'detosefta. We can't find an answer in our Mishnah, but we do have external sources. We have a Braita from the house of Shmuel that they taught in the house of Shmuel, and we have a Tosefta that each one is going to explain one of the opinions, okay? And between the 2, we'll have the answers to our questions. Ditana debei Shmuel. The Braita from the house of Shmuel reads like this, and we're going to hear about Rabbi Eliezer's opinion and what he thinks about the par and the seir when they get done. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yatzav asai elova el ha'am ve'imulei chatat. By the way, it mentions here, and the imulim are burnt with the ayil. Okay, so again, you did the par, you burnt it outside, but you took out the innards and you put it in this bowl to wait till it was time to burn it. You read from the Torah, then you did the ayil and the el ha'am, and then you burned the innards of the sacrifices we did previously. Aval. Par ha'olah v'shivat ha'kfasim v'seir na'asa b'chutz im tamid shel bein arbaim. All the rest of it, this seems to possibly contradict what our Mishnah said, because our Mishnah said he does the elo ve'el ha'am and the shivat ha'kfasim. According to Rashi, that the tamid shel bein arbaim happened in the 5th tefillah. This source actually contradicts, because it sticks the 7 sheep with the par and with the seir that are all done in the 5th tefillah. According to those who say it happened in the 3rd tefillah, it's just chronologically within the 3rd tefillah, that happens last. Okay? So it's not actually a contradiction. And what we filled in here is when we do the par ha'olah and when we do the seir nasa b'chutz. We still don't have a perfect answer, because we're told that they're done with the tamid shel bein arbaim, but nobody really tells us when the tamid shel bein arbaim is. So we're a little bit stuck with not knowing whether it was in the 3rd tefillah or the 5th tefillah. Rabbi Akiva de Tosefta Mahi, which by the way is a good example of sometimes they don't spell something out because it's so obvious to them, but clearly it wasn't so obvious what it was, because Rashi says one thing, others say something else. So it becomes later generations really didn't really know what they meant. Rabbi Akiva to Tosefta Mahi. Where's Rabbi Akiva in the Tosefta? Detanya, Rabbi Akiva Omer. Par ha'olah v'shivat ha'kfasim im tamid shel shachar yukrivim. Here you have it. The par goes together with the 7 kfasim. Shneamar milvad olat haboker asher le'olat tamid. Where does he get this from? Because it says, this is a verse about the Musaf in general. It's not talking about Yom Kippur. It's in Bamidbar, in that chapter, which talks in Parsha Pinchas, which talks about all the sacrifices. And it says, in addition to the Ola, you do all these Musaf additional sacrifices after you do the Tamid Shel Shachar. So therefore we assume the extra Musaf sacrifices you do after the Tamid Shel Shachar. V'achar kach avodat hayom. You only get to Yom Kippur after that. V'achar kach, what's the problem though? He had the seir separate. Why does he have the seir separate? Achar kach seir nasa b'chutz. So why wasn't that? That's also part of the Musaf. Why wasn't it done in the morning? Shneimar seirizim achad lechatat milvad chatat kippurim. Remember, we said before that those words are unnecessary. In addition to the chatat of Yom Kippur, which means after the chatat of Yom Kippur, just like milvad olat tamid meant after the korban tamid. By the way, how do we know Musaf is done right after korban tamid or davening? We always do Musaf right after shacharit. We do have Kriyat Torah in the middle, but basically it's done next to each other. because they did the sacrifices right after. Now, of course, today we have a unique, in Yom Kippur, it's an exception because normally there's nothing else competing. Here we have something else competing, which is where does this Avodat Yom Kippurim come in? And we'll see even more of a debate after when we see this, a bit of a debate about how to understand Rabbi Akiva. So we basically have a split. We put the par, like all the regular Musaf sacrifices in the morning, because the Shiur was listed separately and it said, in addition to the Chatat Kippurim, we said that must be, it was done after the Chatat Kippurim, meaning you do the Yom Kippur service, then Achar Kach Elova El Ha'am, because that appears in chapter 16 of Vayikra. It says, and after he got out of the Kodesh Kodeshim, finished all the work and finished the par on the Shiur, then he does the Elova El Ha'am. It says, he does the Korbanot Olah. So then it must be, right? So the Shiur Izim comes first because it says that comes right after Chatat Kippurim. Then kicks in Pasuk 24 in chapter 16, where then he does the Ayel and the El Ha'am. Then he does the Imorei Chatat, which aren't really mentioned anywhere, but we assume they get burnt at this point. The Achar Kach Tamid Shabein Arbaim. And then you end, as I said, with the afternoon sacrifice. So my Talmid Rabbi Eliezer, why does he think this? He reads it as, no. The Musaf goes at the end. Why does the Musaf go at the end according to him? Because it goes in order of the Torah. Avi Bereisha de Torah Kohanim. First we do what it says in Vayikra. Then you read what it says in Bamidbar. In other words, do it in the order. Right? We often say, there's no order. He clearly thought the order was important. Do everything it says there. When you're done with that, move on to Sefer Bamidbar. Rabbi Akiva, we already know, as it says, he already learned the psukim. There it says you have to do the musaf after shachar. So you do the tamid shel shachar, and then you do the musaf. That all happens in the first tefillah, the first dipping. Then you do the avodat yom kippurim. Then you continue in Vayikra where it says, then you do the ayil, because that it said there, the ram, and then you do the tamid shel ben harbayim. And you have the Shiur Izim, also that goes in there in the later part because of the Milvat Chatat Kippurim. Rabbi Eliezer, Hai Milvat Chatat Kippurim my Avidei. If he thinks the Shiur goes with all the others in the morning, what does he do with that verse? Teaches you a totally different halacha, which we're going to learn much more when we get to Masechet Shvuot. Don't ask why it's in Masechet Shvuot. You'll see when we get there to the first mission, it starts comparing a bunch of things. One of them is, because Shvuot is about swearing. This has nothing to do with swearing. It's about the korbanot. In general, you bring a chatat. You bring a series in the chatat on all these holidays and on Rosh Chodesh, which comes to atone for sins of, I went into the temple tameh, or I had meat that was tameh in the temple, some sort of tumah having to do with the temple. And likewise here, that's what our Shiur is for. And so is the Shiur on Yom Kippur. The Shiur L'Hashem is also for that. And the point is to tell you that just like there, we're going to learn this whole thing. There has to have had some sort of knowledge. If you didn't know you were tameh, you didn't know it was usher to go into the mikdash tameh, you didn't know anything about it, there was no knowledge of anything, this wouldn't actually work to atone for you. You have to have some knowledge for it to work to atone. So therefore, they're saying it's to teach you that just the Yom Kippur one, the Chatat Kippurim, that also atones for Tumat Mikdash, is just like the Shiur Izim Chatat that we know only atones if you have some sort of knowledge. You had to have some knowledge and then forgot some part, but if you never had knowledge at all, then it wouldn't work. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishmo. Okay, now we're going to have a debate about Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yehuda says he said the 7 fasim are done with the Tamid Shel Shachar. But now we're going to have a debate. That's not really so. And what's the debate? Echad karev Tamid Shel Shachar v'shisham Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim. We split the 7. 1 is done in the morning, but 6 are done in the afternoon with the tamid of the afternoon. My Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Omer Mishmo, Shisha krevim Tamid Shel Shachar v'echad Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim. He says the reverse. He agrees there's a split, but he says 6 are done in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. So first we're going to see why do they both agree that it's split, and then what's the difference between them, and that's what we'll finish off with today. My Tamai de Rabbanan, there's 2 different psukim. Ktiv, milvad olat haboker. In addition to the olah, right? You have to do it with the tamid of shachar. That's what we saw already. Uktiv yatzav asat olato. But then it says in that verse 24 of chapter 16, he then goes out and does his olah. And they're assuming that includes all the korbanot olah. So you do some in the morning, some in the afternoon. What's the root of their machloket? Why does one say 1 and 6 and one says 6 and 1? Rabbi Yehuda savar avid chad k'dichtiv mavad olat haboker. You have to do one because it says you do. But hadar avid avodat hayom. We'd rather you get to the main central work of the day, the par and the seer. So just do one, the yotze, get it done. Then do the avodat hayom. Maybe he'll get weak and he won't be able to finish the avodah of Yom Kippur, the central part. We want to make sure he gets there before he gets too weak. Rabbi Shimon says the exact reverse. We're worried if you don't do 6, we understand you have to split, but do most of them, because once you get through the central work of the Yom Kippur, you might forget about the rest of them and you might not do it. So get most of them done. So at least most of them are done. Maybe you'll forget about them by the time you're done with all the work on Yom Kippur. We're not worried you're going to get too weak to do Avodah Yom Kippurim. Clearly, you're going to get to Avodah Hayom. We're not worried you're going to get too weak for that. You're not going to forget about that. That's the main part. It's just that we're going to leave over only one ram, because maybe one sheep, because maybe you'll forget and never get back to it. Everyone agrees, though, there's only one ayah. Kiman kirebi. And this is a debate. Both of them agree there was only one ayah. The ayah mentioned there is the same ayah that was in Sefer Bamidbar, but not all agree. And this must hold just like Rebbe. Rebbe Yomer. Ayah lechad. When it says there's one ram, that's the ram that was mentioned in Bamidbar. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon disagrees. It says no, there's no crossover between the two sections. There's an ayah that's special for your part of the Yom Kippur service, and there's an ayah that's part of the musaf, which are the additional offerings on Yom Kippur. They're two different things. So now, my time of the Rebbe, it says in Bamidbar there's one ayah. Echad means there's only one. There's no other one. Rabbi Shimon, my echad. Echad means miyuchad shebedron. Echad means special, not one and not two. It means find the most special animal. The Rebbe, where does he learn it from? If he needs echad to teach you numbers, you're supposed to. There's a different pasuk which says you're supposed to bring the best of your animals. Rabbi Shimon says, oh, that's talking about voluntary. You need chad b'chova, chad b'nidava utzricha. One for voluntary, one for obligatory. You might have thought, I'm not going to get into the logic here, you can think about it on your own. You could make a logical argument saying, only by nidava you need to bring your most special animal, but not by obligatory ones, or the reverse. Therefore, echad comes to teach you miyuchad, here when it's obligatory, and mivchar nidarecha teaches you bring the best when it comes to voluntary. We'll end here for today. Shavua tov to everyone, and we'll pick up from here tomorrow.